on the website though. Cool.
There we go. You're all yours, Matt.
Okay. Thanks, David. Give me one sec here. Okay, you should see my screen now. So I know we've had a Mead presentation. It was a long time ago now, actually. And it was really from a commercial perspective in Ontario, which was interesting. I'd never, seen that many commercial meaderies in Ontario. This is really all my perspective from learning it through, the homebrew model, through just learning from home, doing my research, that type of thing. So let's start with what mead really is. So they love to throw around these terms when you're talking about mead. The oldest fermented beverage, is the ancestor of all alcoholic beverages, the nectar of the gods. But really, let's focus on making it, not its history. So it's honey wine ultimately. And why make it? Well, I was really interested in just the idea of it. I'd heard about it, and it's something I'd never personally experienced when I started making mead. What I found was it's a super versatile ingredient. It's very unique tasting. It's hard to find Canadian examples. I know there's a few places that make them, but they're not, you don't see them in the LCBO that often. They're really hard to find. And they're expensive when you do find them. It's a wine product that comes from an expensive ingredient. It's going to be an expensive product at the end, and you age it for a year, 2 years, 3 years more. You know what I mean? So it gets pricey. So a lot of people ask what you should expect from a mead. It's really hard to describe a little bit because you can go so many different directions with them. But to start, ABV, you can make hydromels, you can make standard strength, you can make SAC. So it ranges from about 3.5 to 18%. The standard usually I would say is 12 to 14%, similar to a wine. And a lot of people have the perspective that it's a super sweet drink. It can go from a 0.99 gravity all the way up to a 1.05. To me, the sweet spot for me is that dry to semi-sweet range. I love drier meads, and yeah. And what's it actually taste like? So traditional mead is probably the best example for your classic mead. So basically think of it as it has a white wine type taste, but you get those definite honey notes in there. It has that honey backbone in there. But really there's a lot of factors here. So honey varietals, if you quickly look up honey on the internet, you'll find there's hundreds of varietals of honey, single source honey, different wildflower blends. There's a ton of different types. The yeast you use is obviously going to give it a certain character. You can use wine yeast, beer yeast, Kvike, but I'll go into it a little bit more a bit later. And really the other ingredients. So it's not just traditionals. It's not just honey, yeast, and water. Honey as a base, and you ferment it and make a high percentage beverage, it's the perfect base for adding other things. It's the perfect base to add adjuncts in, fruit, spices, etc. So let's jump into honey a little bit. Honey, you always think of Billy B from the grocery store, and that's kind of that classic taste that everyone associates with honey. It goes so much further, so much beyond that. To start, I would always recommend going to a local apiary, finding some wildflower honey. You'll be amazed at the different tastes you can get from wildflower honey. Even if you get them in different parts of Ontario, they're going to taste different just because of the different things that these pollinate. I always would suggest finding a local apiary, go in, talk to the guy or girl, and just try the honeys. That's how I got my first few honeys. I went in, I sampled their product, and I said, this is really interesting, I'll try this type thing. And for me, it was interesting too to see he had 2 wildflower honeys. He had an early season and a late season, and they actually tasted completely different. I found the late season had a lot more aromatics, and it's just whatever's in bloom at that time will really influence the taste of the honey. And what if you don't have a local option? So for that, I would suggest checking out Dutchman's Gold. They're not the cheapest, but I found their honey was quite good quality. And right now during COVID, it used to be $100, but right now anything over $30, they ship for free across Ontario, which is pretty awesome. Again, support local if you can. That's an option for you. And then for me, as Eric was saying, I buy big buckets of honey. I tend to buy 15 kilograms at a time just because it's cheaper to buy in bulk. 15 kilograms, it results in like two 14%-ish meads, or you can go a ton of session meads, or you can go kind of one sack strength and one lighter strength. It's enough honey to really make a good, well, that's 5-gallon batches I'm talking about, but it's enough honey to really experiment with. And what I found really interesting is you always hear about like orange blossom from the States and how it brings such a unique kind of taste to mead. And I'm sure it does. I've never used orange blossom because it's really hard to get here and it's really expensive to get here. Well, my suggestion is like, you'll be surprised if you go into certain apiaries, they actually have an interesting selection of different honeys. I found basswood honey in Canada. I found blueberry blossom honey. There's some really interesting single source honeys you can actually find here. And I would suggest starting there if you're looking for something different beyond wildflower, where you're looking for some unique taste. Also, if anyone has questions, just feel free to ask as I'm going through this. I also at the top here, you can see it's almost like, it reminds me of SRM a little bit, but you can see the range of how far honeys go in color. On your right-hand side, you'd have something like a buckwheat. The blueberry blossom honey I have is probably a light amber, but the basswood I had was like water white. I remember racking my mead that I made from it and thinking this looks exactly like water as I was racking it. So this was just something I found on the internet. It's not super detailed, but it kind of gives you an example of how varied the taste of honey can be. Your wildflower, which is what I'd always suggest starting with, it can have earthy, fresh, herb-like taste. It can be floral, but you can see the range of some of the other ones here, like raspberry, blackberry, buckwheat. You're getting almost like a maltiness to it, where it has the molasses plus earth kind of taste to it. The blueberry I bought, it kind of falls into like a floral and berry kind of mix. I found it really interesting. It doesn't remind you exactly of the fruit. It reminds you of kind of a mix of the fruit with some floral notes to it. Really interesting. But this kind of, it also explores how to taste it in this thing here. I'm not going to go necessarily into that. It was more to show how many different tastes can come from honey and just the potential of what you can get from honey. So I mentioned other ingredients, and here's where you go down a rabbit hole with mead. This picture on the right, it just shows all the different types of mead that people have made and the names for them. You can add, or people have added, almost anything to it, from spices, brewed with apples. Viking blood is you take a base of cherry juice, tart cherry juice, and you ferment it with honey, and that's called Viking's blood. There's a ton of examples in here, even coffee mel, where you brew with coffee and honey and you make a mead out of it. I'll focus on a few of my favorites here. Melomel, it's the classic fruit plus honey, and turning that into a nice fermented beverage. You can go almost any direction with this. There's actually like subcategories within it where it's specific around, your stone fruit and your berries and that type of thing. Braggot. This one's an interesting one from my perspective because it's the best of both worlds. You're using a base of malt. You're basically brewing a beer, and then you're adding honey right into it, and you're using whatever hops you want. The only thing I'll say with this is hops aren't a huge part of it in my mind, unless you're making something more session, because you're usually aging these for a while. So you're mostly going to get a touch of flavor and aromatics, but it's mostly going to age out over time. Pyment, I made one of these a while ago, which is grapes and honey. So these are usually more sack strength just because of the high OG of the grape juice that you're starting with. And then you're adding a significant amount of honey to it. Sicer. This was one of my favorite ones I've made, which is I got some fresh pressed apple cider, and you add a good amount of honey to it, and you make it just comes out really, really, really nice. Obviously needs to age a bit. They come out pretty high percentage. Another one I'm interested in trying that I haven't yet, which is a botchet. A botchet, you actually take the honey and you caramelize it. You cook it for hours, and the color slowly changes. And then you end up with almost like a dark brownish honey, because you do it slow and over time. And then you make a mead out of that. Apparently they're really, really good. So let's go into the process a little bit here. So your first step is really to plan your recipe. As a rule of thumb, they always say 3 pounds of honey for 1 gallon mixed, which would give you around a standard strength for a mead. I'd always suggest going into a calculator where it's going to say, hey, here's your batch size, and here what targeted OG are you going for, and here's how much honey to mix with how much water. It just makes things easier. Next step is really measure out your full volume. Plan for, the volume minus how much the honey is going to add to it. And take that water, and I use tap water, so I add Camden, and I leave it overnight for about 24 hours. If you take the water right away, you throw the Camden in, and then you mix, and then you throw the yeast in, you're going to inhibit that yeast just a little bit. It's better to let the water sit for about 24 hours. And if you're using something bottled, get something with a bit of base minerals. There isn't a ton of research into mead and the mineral profile you're looking for. Most people use tap water, but you want some minerality to the water. You don't want RO water. And then really what you're doing is mixing your honey into the water. This can get messy. You get honey everywhere. It's just going to happen. I tend to use a wine whip. So I attach a wine whip to a drill and just blend it with that to avoid, trying to get a spoon in there and actually working this to a point where it's a fluid kind of same OG throughout. You can use slightly warmed water for this. It would help it mix a bit. And then some recipes will tell you to heat the honey or bring the honey plus water mixture up to a certain temperature. I would never do this, and it's just all you're doing is decreasing the honey aromatics and flavor. I've never thought of a big risk of infection or anything using honey. It's a pretty hard ingredient to kind of get any, you're not going to get a bunch of wild yeast from the honey necessarily. I've never noticed any issue anyways. And then what are you doing? You're taking an OG, making sure you're hitting about the right numbers, and you're adjusting if it's off. You can always add more honey in. I'm lazy. I usually get pretty close and I just go with it. And then you're adding your yeast of choice into the mix. So let's talk about what yeasts you can use here. I've mostly used wine yeasts. My go-to are really D47, which is a white wine. It's good for traditionals. It's good for medium to dry meads, and it really brings up that honey flavor. 71B, anything I add, any cicer I make, any melomel I make, anything with a fruit component or a fruity type taste, I find it works very well, and it rounds out the flavor. It's a yeast that matures quickly as well. And champagne, a lot of people start with champagne. I don't love champagne. The reason it's popular in this world is that it has a wide range of temperatures that you can ferment at, and it'll eat through a lot of sugar, up to I think almost 18% you can go with champagne. So what's fun is we know a lot about beer yeast. So you can definitely play with beer yeast in mead. I honestly suggest it. A lot of people have had really, really good results with this. The one thing to be careful about is you got to plan your OG. Most beer yeast kind of crap out at 10 to 11%. And you don't want, well, maybe you do want, but I don't want a FG of 1.05. I'm not looking for super sweet here. Some thought starters on yeast you could use. So Escarpment Labs Sterling Ale, it's fairly neutral, and I've pushed it to 12.5% in an imperial stout, so it can definitely ferment quite high. Beer garden lager yeast has a nice character, and you could definitely use it in a mead. And then if you're looking for a little more kind of phenolics or your esters, you could also try like the high gravity kind of Trappist yeast, or even a high gravity Belgian yeast as well. And Escarpment has some good examples for that. What I've been seeing as a trend a lot in mead these days is Kvike. There's a few reasons for this. It ferments fast, it has a high alcohol tolerance, and you can have it at a very wide range of temperatures. And it mellows, which, you know, those esters will mellow with the long-term aging, and they won't be kind of that extreme. I don't love Kvike yeast because of how many esters it throws out, but I know some of those esters will work very well, and with long-term aging, they'll smooth out to a point where it works well with the mead you're making. There are also convenient dry packs of this at this point. You can see them all over the place, especially Voss. You can find dry packs of it. Definitely, if you try it out, let me know, because I'm curious and I've never done it before. The one thing to caveat this is I've heard you really need to be careful with your nutrients. You already have to add a lot of nutrients for Kvike, especially. You're going to want to even up that a little bit, just based on how hungry it is. Okay, so what's the process? So your primary fermentation. So you're adding in your yeast of choice. As an extra step here, I recommend using Go Firm for dry yeast before adding it in, to make sure your yeast is active and healthy before it's heading into your must. You're planning out your nutrient additions. So I always recommend Tosno, which is Tailored Organic Staggered Nutrient Additions. I think you'll find it everywhere, and anything you read about mead, Tosno is always recommended. Tosno is basically your planning additions of nutrients at 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, and 1/3 sugar break. So as soon as your OG is gone down by about 1/3, you would add your last addition. What it is equal amounts of nutrient you're adding along that timeline. And it really, the whole idea is it makes a really smooth, even fermentation throughout the whole process. I tend to use a wine whip and degas before adding nutrients. There's a lot of examples on the internet of volcanoes and people creating like mead volcanoes by adding nutrients in before degassing. And it's just kind of comes up their fermenter and actually shoots at the top. I've never had it myself, but it doesn't look fun. So degassing, it's recommended to degas twice per day for the first up until 1/3 sugar break. I did this for my first mead. I'm honestly too lazy to do this at this point. I tend to do about once a day, and I haven't noticed a difference in quality doing about once a day. It's a lot of effort to get out your wine whip, you know, sanitize it, stick it in the must, and then, or stick it in your mead, and then, you know, get all the CO2 out that many times. And then once you hit that 1/3 sugar break, you've added your nutrient addition. Just don't bother with any more oxygen exposure at that point. Leave it a few weeks, and then take a gravity reading. After a few weeks, you should be about your final gravity at that point. So what to expect from the ferment? Coming from the beer world, we're used to seeing that Kreuzen. You're used to seeing a lot of activity, the yeast swirling around in your clear fermenter. This you won't see as much. You should see the following really. You see bubbles coming up actively out of the solution. They should come up at a good rate. You see your airlock steadily bubbling, and sometimes you get like this little layer of bubbles on top. That's about it. If you've made cider, it's a very similar experience to making cider to how the ferments look. And then what's the whole point of this nice steady fermentation and nutrient additions? You're really just looking for a steady ferment. The word that gets thrown around, and I threw in this, you know, GME meme on this right-hand side here. The word that gets thrown around a lot is rocket fuel. A very fast and aggressive ferment, which I find champagne yeast does, and it takes a long time to age out because it creates rocket fuel. It creates a lot of fusel alcohols, which take a very long time to mellow. And that's to me, what you're trying to avoid. You want a drinkable product. 6 months, you want it to be really good by a year to 2 years. You don't want to be waiting forever to really drink it. So also coming from the beer world, this is a weird idea, but I do recommend it. There are a few yeasts where they say actually they're kind of like surlees, mostly wine yeast, where they actually say it's no problem. You can leave them on the lees. It'll actually add an interesting flavor. But in this case, you're leaving in the fermenter for so long that you want to actually get it off of the yeast. The yeast at some point will die and it'll produce some off flavors if you don't actually transfer to secondary. That being said, I haven't experimented with not doing this step, but everything I've read always suggests this in the mead world. So transferring to secondary, you want your mead to hit your FG or very close to it, and you're transferring into another fermenter. I always plan my volume so that the next fermenter I send it into, it's basically full. You can see that in these 4 on the left here. These aren't mine, these aren't from my mead making, but it's just an example of how full you want your fermenters to be for secondary. I always recommend bulk aging. It'll help with clarity and it makes a consistent product. If you can bulk age for 3 months, if you can bulk age for a year, just leave it, just let it sit and you'll get a really consistent product at the end. I find if you put it in bottles, you can actually get one bottle varying from others because it ages differently when you do that. As a whole thing together, it's much better. I always add adjuncts during secondary. So this is where I'll put my oak, my fruit, my spices. And you can effectively plan for your contact time. You can put them in a bag that you can pull out of secondary, or you can, plan for your oak amount of time in secondary and put it near the end of near the end of your bulk aging so that you get the right taste before you bottle. And clarifying your mead. We're in a world where clarity doesn't matter that much anymore, where, NEPA's rule, but mead was always kind of that beverage that you want, that sparkling clarity, the wine type clarity when you're looking at it. Time is a really good way to get clarity. I tend to give it a boost. I use bentonite. There's a lot of other clarity products. I just find bentonite, you mix it in when you transfer into secondary, and you'll just hit clarity a lot quicker with it. And it actually tends to, you see that layer on the bottom after about a week with using it, I find. So bottling. So here's a different step, stabilizing. So for me, I always try to ferment fully dry, and then I tend to stabilize my mead and I tend to back sweet. So I use potassium metabisulfate. This is Camden, but it's the potassium version. I always make sure to get the potassium version because if you're using the sodium version, you can actually add a bit of sodium because you're adding quite a lot in to stabilize your mead. So I'd always recommend the potassium version. And then you're adding potassium sorbate, which kind of slows mead's efforts to ferment, basically. And you leave these for a few days after adding them. I give it up to a week before I do anything else like back sweeten. Which would be your next step. So you can use non-fermentables and you can not even worry about stabilizing if that's what you'd like to do. But if you stabilize, you can add any form of sugar. You can add brown sugar, fruit juice. Some people use honey. BJCP, I've avoided it just because they always recommend you shouldn't have a kind of raw honey taste to your mead at all. It should be that fermented honey taste. So I've always avoided it. I've heard people had good results. Acid blend. Some people add acid blend to their finished product. To be honest, I've never done this, and I don't have too much experience here. I've always been pretty happy with my finished products as they tend to go dry. They actually say acid blends usually a bigger factor if you make sweet meads. You're trying to balance out that sweetness with a bit of that acidity, but there are cases for, acid blend. If there's the word flabby that people throw around for mead, you can make a kind of flabby mead without having the right acid balance. So that's a case where you want to add some, but ultimately it's tasting your end product, seeing if you're happy with it. And then if you're not, play around with some acid to a point where you're using small samples and you know the concentrations you're adding in and taste until you hit the point. I like carb. I tend to add carbonation to my meads. I go through all these steps. I hit a point where I back sweetened if I want to, and then I throw it in a keg and I carbonate it. I find carbonating meads it feels a little more awkward. It seems to take more time. I find I just set it at a certain PSI that I'm aiming for, and I just leave it for a bit of time before I bottle off of it. If you're bottle conditioning, just note that you either have to keep it fully dry or you have to use non-fermentable sugars. If you're going to add if you're not stabilizing it, you need to skip that stabilizing step is really what I'm trying to say here, because otherwise your yeast won't do anything. It won't eat that sugar and it won't make carb. That being said, you can just have still mead. A lot of people prefer still mead. I just tend to like bubbly. I come from a beer world. I like my beverages to have a little sparkle to them. And I tend to just put them in beer bottles, 355s. I find it's the right amount. I don't want 750 milliliters of mead when I'm drinking it. Usually I find 355s are fine for me, and I leverage my beer gear. But you can use wine bottles, and wine bottles, as you can see at the top here, they look nice. Once you put it in, it's got that perfect clarity. Put a nice label on it. It does look like a really nice finished product at that point. So just some tips and tricks that things that I've learned along the way. Enhancing fruit flavors. So some fruit, it's really hard to get that flavor from, especially when you go into the kind of like the fermented format. So what I tend to do is add them in secondary, where you get the fermented fruit taste. And then sometimes I consider, if I want a little bit more of that same fruit taste, I'll stabilize the mead and I'll back sweeten with that same type of juice. If I make a cherry mead, sometimes I back sweeten with cherry juice. And I up the sweetness while upping the fruit flavor as well. This one's a little, people don't love lactose sometimes. I find in meads, actually, it helps add body. Session meads especially, a bit of lactose can add that body that I find is lacking. It can up that mouthfeel. Some session meads can just feel like water in your mouth, and adding a bit of lactose can give you the balance of the touch of sweetness you want, as well as increasing your body. Oak. You can experiment with a lot of different types, and I encourage, and it's really learning the character you like. I've used American, I've used Hungarian, I haven't used French yet, actually, but they do have different characters and they do age differently, and there's something to experiment with. Avoid chips. I always avoid chips. I focus on cubes and spirals. Chips are just like this fast oak bomb you throw in your mead, and you want to let it sit on chips for too long. It'll just suck that oak tannin out of it. Cubes, you can let it mellow for 1 to 2 months sitting on those cubes, and actually it just gives you a way more well-rounded oak when you let it sit. And taste often. My first basswood mead I made was a traditional. I made 6 gallons. I split it into 3 and 3. I added a spiral to 3 of those gallons, and I'm still aging it to this day to hope that the oak goes down, because once you over oak, it's very hard to correct. You can't go back at that point. You think it's going to age out, it takes years to age out over oaking. So process tips. I always try to ferment fully dry and back sweeten. I just find it gives you more control over the process. You can control the sweetness more effectively. Some people will say, hey, build your OG so far above what the yeast can do so that you get to an OG that's still sweet. You don't have a good amount of control there, in my opinion, and sometimes you end up with a mead that's either overly sweet, or your yeast does a really good job and it's not sweet enough. I find to go dry is better and back sweeten. Session meads, something that not a lot of people talk about necessarily. There's actually a company that was putting them in the LCBO for a while. I never tried them, but they're fun to experiment with, especially if you just want to kind of dip your toes in a little bit. The cost of entry is lower. You're not using a ton of honey, and you can learn the honey character, and you can turn them around in 2 weeks, similar to a beer. they can come out delicious. But my issue was always connected to this one over here, which is they lack body. So I would hit them with a bit of lactose and carb, and it ups the body, is what I usually do with my sessions. Split batching. So for me, I'm always trying to learn more and quickly about fermented beverages. For me, split batching was the way to do this with larger batches of mead. What I do is I tend to make 6 gallons to begin with, and I have 2 of those better bottles that are the 3-gallon better bottle. So what I do is take my 6 gallons and then I split it into the 3 gallon containers, and I fill them up to the brim. And then one, if you're making it traditional, you can keep 1 non-oak, 1 oak, or you can add fruit to 1/2, or you can add spices to 1/2. It just gives you a bit more room to play around and figure out what you like. You could also take a 5-gallon batch or a 5 and a little and split it into 5 1-gallon containers and do something different, each of those 1 gallons. And you learn a lot by doing that, and you learn what you like, which I think is important. So that's really the process. Now I'll just really go into kind of some ideas, some things that I've done in the past or present in this case. This is my most recent batch, just transferred into secondary. That was like a couple weeks ago, that picture. So what did I do? This is a 6-gallon blueberry blossom mead. Actually from Dutchman Gold, I found out they had blueberry blossom honey. I wanted to try it. I ordered a big container of it, as I do. I used 71B yeast for this one. It had an OG of 1.11. The FG, it was basically done. I'm pretty sure it wasn't going to drop much past this. Again, I wanted this to ferment fully dry. Didn't quite get there, but that's okay. I'm going to leave it for enough time and stabilize it at the end. But I racked it. It was about 14% when I racked it, and I split it into 3 gallons blueberry vanilla. So the blueberry vanilla, you can see the blueberries at the bottom and the top here floating. I added 2 kilograms of frozen blueberries, and there's 2 vanilla beans in there as well. So that's aging like that right now. And then I kept half traditional. I thought the blueberry blossom had a really cool taste to it. I wanted to see it in, the most natural way in a mead. So this is just a pure traditional blueberry blossom mead. I'll taste it later. I'll decide if I want to oak or not. This one, so this was actually, if you remember that cider buy that happened at the end of 2019, November 2019, someone came into the chat and said, hey, I have a ton of cider. A ton of people from the club bought cider. I was one of them. I bought 5 gallons of fresh pressed cider. Really nice acid balance of the juice that he had, really nice cider in general. And then I added a mix of basswood and wildflower honey. And I used 71 of B again. This is fruit forward. I had an OG of around 1.098, and I finished perfectly dry. This was about 13% ABV. And again, I split batched this. I made 3 gallons. I added basically a bag with a bunch of spices in it that I could pull out. You can see the color difference. That's the one on the left here, where I added 1.5 pounds of brown sugar, 2 vanilla beans, and then a mix of apple pie spices. So nutmeg, allspice, cinnamon. It came out like drinking an apple pie, basically. It's like semi-sweet. It's really, really, really delicious. The right-hand side was, I just kept kind of semi-sweets, where I just added brown sugar to this. And it's like a cider on steroids. It's so good. And the one thing I did kind of mess up here, but it made it a little more interesting, is when I put this in the keg and I mixed it with the brown sugar actually varied from the top to the bottom how sugary it was. So it didn't mix thoroughly. So as I was bottling this, I was like, oh, this is too sweet. And then by the end, I was tasting it. I was like, oh, this isn't like sweet at all anymore. So what it was I got a lot more of the sugars on the bottom than the top. So when I put these into bottle, I labeled them by row, like row 1, row 2, row 3. And I actually know that these are sweeter versus these are drier. So a mistake, but it actually let me experiment with the sweetness of it as well, which is interesting. Okay, and finally, one more. This is, I made about 6 gallons of, I called it a Doppelbock braggot. So this was, I made the base of a beer, which was 5 pounds Munich, 5 pounds Vienna, 2 pounds Pilsen, and then a color adjust. And this seems like a lot of crystal malt, but I actually did this for a reason. I wanted to keep some sweetness. I didn't want this to dry out. One of the classic things with, a Doppelbock is you want to balance the sweetness with the other elements. You want there to be a sweet component. You don't want it to go perfectly dry, in my opinion. And I added 0.6 ounce of Warrior and 0.5 Tetman. And then what I did was I waited for high Kreuzen. I added 7 pounds of blueberry blossom and 2 additions that I blended into this throughout kind of primary fermentation. I used Imperial Harvest here, which has a higher alcohol tolerance. It was about a 1.104 OG, and it finished about 1.024, about 11, a little over 11%. This one, I was worried the whole time. I was like, this is never actually going to taste that great because it was pretty rocket fuel-y to begin with. It's been over a year now, and I'm tempted to get out a bottle every weekend because it's so good at this point. The malt just brings in the body you're looking for, that kind of beer type element to it. You can see the head doesn't last, but actually pours with a head to begin with. And you get the maltiness, you get the blueberry blossom floral berry backbone to it, and you get that yeast taste, or the classic kind of lager component to it. I'm really tempted to remake this recipe and experiment more with braggots just because of how well this turned out. So I just wanted to throw in a quick slide here, which is just like, I only brew beer. I'm not interested in mead. Like, what can I get from this? Number one, put down the Billy Bee. Try some honey that has a little bit more to it. Go get some local wildflower honey and try that in your beers. It can bring beautiful aromatics. It helps to dry out beers, and it has no IBUs. So if you're thinking of, some Saison or not, some Brett Saison where you don't want IBUs, not Brett Saison, or like a mixed firm that you don't want IBUs, you can always add honey, which is going to bring something interesting to the table. For me, some of the starting styles, blonde ale, classic honey blonde, honey brown, Saison. It's like you're just bringing some new aromatics to your Saison. Imperial stout, you can up your OG by using some honey. Lagers, so a lot of times you're drying out a lager. You can dry it out using honey and add some super interesting flavor as well while doing it. And anywhere where you're really trying to do that, you're putting sugar in your beer, you can use honey as a substitute, and you can get more through that honey than you get with just adding sugar. To me, try a braggot. Honestly, I'm super impressed with the first one I made. It's an idea that I read about it and I was like, I have to try this. You're basically taking half your fermentables from malt and half your fermentables from honey. And that's what you're doing. You're building a recipe that way. It's weird how you have to plan your recipe because it's going to dry out a lot from the honey, but it makes a really interesting recipe, really interesting idea. My next idea is I'm going to get more honey soon from a place near Barrie. I'm going to try a Saison braggot it'll be a high percentage Saison where I'm really looking for a lot of those aromatics from, the honey as well. And then finally, if you want to learn more, so I tend to surf Reddit pretty often. For me, the Mead subreddit has been a good resource. It has great info around recipe, process, and there's some great examples from others. Facebook, there's a Mead group on Facebook. You will see some nonsense in here, but at the same time, you'll see some people who make beautiful meads. They'll post their recipes. You can ask them. You can say, hey, what did you do? Like, why did you do that? How can I make this? There's one podcast about mead that I found, which is the Mead House. They're focused purely on mead. They talk to people making meads, people making commercial examples in the US, and there's some smart mead makers on it. I'm sorry, did someone say something there? Oh. No, it's all good. Explore commercial examples. This is tough in Canada. Marcelo was telling me the other day, actually, that he found one and he was super impressed with someone that was making mead, and they were going to like a commercial format. They're hard to find here. One of the reasons is our laws around making wine, or you have to like own whatever makes the fermentable. So you need to own, I think it's like 300 hives or something crazy to actually make your own mead, or you have to work with someone who owns that many and get in with them, kind of thing. The same as you have to have for winemaking, you have to grow the grapes yourself. They put the same restrictions on mead, which seems crazy to me, but I think things will eventually change here. And then finally, reach out to me about anything. I'm always happy to talk about recipes, meads, whatever. If you're interested, just reach out. And that's about it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them out.
There was a couple questions that came up in the chat.
Oh, I've been ignoring it.
That's okay. I know that I know Bob had a question surrounding temperature of the fermentation.
Yeah. So is it around a specific type of yeast? Because generally each of these yeasts have guidelines around the temps. A lot of them are okay at room temperature. I tend to keep them in a cool place still because they're going to heat up a bit as they ferment. If you're using beer yeast, I would just stick to the exact guidelines. My rule of thumb is generally I look at the temp range for the yeast, and I aim probably the bottom quarter of that temp range usually to start, and you can always raise it up from there if your fermentation's slow.
And I think Jesse also had a question about nutrient additions. He said, I haven't really done staggered nutrient additions so far because I'm mostly do small batches, and the recommended amounts seem very difficult to measure since it's quite small. If I add too much nutrient at each addition point, would it create any issues or off flavors?
So if you do add too much nutrient, you can kind of get that nutrient taste sticking around. Ferment O, kind of Ferment K and O, they do have a distinct taste to them, and you want the yeast to eat all that addition. To me, I'm not perfectly accurate. I think if you keep it within a reasonable range and you're not going to, like, if you're not putting 2 times the amount, you're going to be fine at the end of your mead. Yeah, I would try to avoid it if you can. If you can't, it's not a big deal.
Okay. And Jordan also had a question regarding oak. He said, can I use small amounts of oak over a longer period of time? Or is there a reason why I wouldn't want to do that?
I always actually recommend start lower and keep it going with time for oak. This is one of my first mistakes. I added, a whole spiral and thought, hey, if I add this spiral for a week, I'm going to get the amount of oak I want and I'll pull out the spiral. It's very easy to overdo it in that format. You're better off going with, I like cubes now, to be honest. I add a small amount of cubes. I let it sit over time. If you need more cubes, you can always just, boil a couple more and add them in. It's not a big deal.
Okay. And I know there was a question also about Costco honey. And I know that there's yes and no's on that one. So
my first batch was Costco apple juice and Costco honey. Actually, the first sicer I ever made was that profile right there. It didn't turn out amazing, but my process wasn't very optimal when I made that. I've heard good and bad things about Costco honey. I do think they actually source they get it from a reasonable source, from what I've heard mostly. The issue is whenever I look it up, I end up finding American articles about where they're sourcing their honey. I don't actually know and have that much information about Canadian honey and where they get it from.
Okay. And Steve had a question about the botchet. So it involves, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, not bochet. So it involves caramelizing.
I said botchet, but it is bochet.
Okay. So it involves caramelizing some of the honey. Can you elaborate?
Actually, a lot of people use like crock pots where they can set it at a certain temperature, and over time you check on it every once in a while. And actually, people do this for like 8 hours a lot of the time to actually get the color of the honey they're looking for. I've seen a lot of people, what they do when they make these is they'll get a piece of paper and they mark the time of each honey. And what they do is they put a dab. They put a dab at an hour in, 2 hours in, 3 hours in, and you can actually see the color of the honey change over time to the point where it's an amber, a brown, like almost those colors by the end that you make.
Nice, nice. Daryl wanted to know about how much potassium metabisulfite and potassium sorbate are you adding to 5 gallons?
That is a good question, and I can't give you a direct answer because it varies by your ABV and by your pH. There is certain amounts you can add in that will kind of guarantee your stabilization, but I would always recommend using this guide right here. Let me see if I can actually pull it up quickly if my window will work. Here, one sec. Can you see that window?
Yes.
Okay, so here you'll see, this is for K-Meta, but depending on your pH of your finished mead, the amount you add for 5 gallons will vary. Higher pH means you're adding more potassium metabisulfate. Lower pH, you're adding less, actually. And then the same deal with potassium sorbate, but it's all around your ABV. So depending on how high you go with your ABV, you either have to add more or less of your potassium sorbate. So I would always recommend using something like this and knowing your ABV and final statistics of your mead so you can do this accurately. If you really have to though, and you didn't even take an OG, you can always kind of go on the high end of this, and I don't think you'll have a negative result in your mead.
And there was a question that, where was it there? Nick had, should staggered nutrients be used for sizers?
So what I tend to do as a rule of thumb is, well, sizers I would tend to side on I would tend to side towards the full nutrient additions. I know apples do have some of the things that yeast is looking for, but not as much as like a beer base. For me, like I'll give an example. My braggot was half fermentables from malt, which has, you know, what yeast is looking for, and half fermentables from honey. What I did was that I did half a tosna, half the staggered nutrient additions for the honey side of things, where it doesn't really have the nutrients that the yeast is looking for. I would tend to do that with a sizer too, where you're using less nutrients, but you're still using nutrients to ensure your fermentation is happy.
Okay, and I think one more question was about, is mead more forgiving with regards to contamination, or does one still need to be conscious of sanitizing everything like with beer?
So this one is going to depend a lot on your ABV. If you're creating a high ABV environment, it's harder for contamination to get in, that's for sure, because it's going to have a hard time in that 14 to 18% environment. If you're making a session mead, you still have to worry about contamination in the exact same way as beer. I come from the beer world. I always worry about sanitation, but that being said, I've done things like split a vanilla bean and throw them straight in the mead that was 14% and not worried that much about it, knowing that it's a certain environment that, you know, prohibits the growth of those wild yeast. So I would always suggest decide on, you know, the side of caution. Have I always done that? Not necessarily.
Right. I don't know if there's any other questions for Matt. I went through all the questions in the chat, so if anybody has any questions.
Thanks.
I was going to say, we were talking about Shrams in the chat, and I think you had a reference on your first slide about a lot of mead is expensive. And yes, but I didn't really like mead until I went to Shrams and then tried their mead, and then I realized what mead could be.
That's the thing. A lot of the commercial examples you get that are lower price point are lower price point for a reason. They're bad experience for your first meads.
Yeah. I think like in Ontario, it's really tough because there's this stupid rule where you have to own 100 hives in order to sell mead.
Yeah.
That's why like places like Monroe and Rosewood and Back by Bees are like the only commercial meaderies that have storefronts. But like you go to Michigan and like mead is huge there. Bee Nectar and Shrams. Obviously, I'm dangling this place that none of us can go to.
Yeah, I know. I always look at that and I listen to, Mead House, and they're always talking about, their mead delivery that month. And it's like all these insanely good sounding meads. It's like, it's one of the biggest growing alcohol categories in the States, or was for a while, anyways.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. If you go to some of the mead Facebook groups or whatever, like there's a huge homebrew mead culture in the States. There's something called the American Mead Makers Association, the AMMA, and like they're all talking about judging the Mazer Cup every year, which is the big mead competition, and they're all brewing with like 500 or $5,000 buckets of meadow foam honey.
Yeah. Yeah, metal foam just sounds ridiculous, but it's so expensive.
I remember I judged traditionals at NHC final round one year, and someone had entered a meadow foam mead and it tasted like marshmallows. And we drank as little of the bottle as possible to judge it. And then I capped it and took the bottle with me and then shared it with a bunch of people because it was that good.
Yeah, it sounds insane. It's like vanilla honey, basically. It's supposed to come out, yeah, exactly like marshmallows.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in some comments, not necessarily questions. I think you did a great job covering a lot of the stuff, and that doppelbock sounds amazing.
Yeah, you need to try something like that, Eric.
Need to try yours.
I have like I have probably 36 bottles in the closet right beside me. I'll bring some down at a meeting when we can have meetings again.
I'm looking forward to that then. I guess another thing, so like mead is always like, I guess people who used to go to the club meetings when Shane was still attending and bringing his crazy meads. So like they don't always have to be like the 18% blow your face off, 30% blow your face off, whatever that was. I mean, yeah, the session meads are big, and like there's that company, the Royal Canadian Mead Company, that was trying to do session meads for a while. I don't know if they still are. So I think they changed leadership quite a bit. But Backed by Bees is also doing a lot of session meads that I'm looking forward to. I guess I should probably just do an order because I'm not going to make it there anytime soon.
Yeah, I follow them. I'm always interested in what they're doing. I need to order something from them. I've only ever had their mead at that meeting, that one meeting they had. Yeah.
Same. It was tasty there.
It was good. Yeah, it was really good.
All right. Sorry, just throwing in some random comments. Thanks for presenting. Appreciate it.
No, of course. It's an interesting topic, and again, it's something you can't get a lot of. So make it yourself and see what happens. You'll learn what you like. It's a cool fermentable, that's for sure.
Oh, I remember my question now. What vessel are you doing primary in? I've always done a bucket because I found it easier to stir, and like the volume is big enough. It's not going to over foam. It's not going to foam over the top of the bucket.
Yep.
Like versus a carboy, but.
Yeah, I use either a 6 or 7 gallon bucket, or I use a Fermonster where it has that wide mouth that you can get whatever you need in there.
Yeah.
Those are my two go-tos. It depends whatever I'm fermenting in other ones, and if I have a Fermonster available, that's usually my priority because they're 7 gallons and they have a ton of space for whatever you need, basically.
And do you always do 5 gallons of mead?
Generally, yeah. From the beginning, actually, I went head first and I was like, if I'm doing it, I may as well, go deep and see what happens. My first batch probably shouldn't have been a 5 gallon batch. I would encourage starting with like a gallon, but yeah.
So I have a question.
Hey, go ahead.
I am about to do mine. I was able to hold off. I think I have 3 kilos that I got from the same guy that was selling the mead. It's a wide flower, yada yada. I don't remember the details. It's there in the thing. Now I forgot about it and I kept in the fridge. Do I have to warm it up?
The honey, you mean, you kept in the fridge?
Yes.
Oh, you don't have to keep honey in the fridge in any sense.
Yes, I just forgot about it.
It'll make it easier to work with. It's going to be really awkward to work with some cold honey because it's going to pour really slow and be really awkward.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Just put some warm water around the recipient, right? Okay.
Exactly. That's what I'd recommend. You can also, a lot of times when you have honey for a long time, it'll crystallize itself. And in that case, you do actually have to warm up the outside, get it moving again so that you can transfer it.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah, so same idea. Either way, you can always mix. When you mix in, you can mix with a little warm water to get the honey moving so you can transfer it easy. But
Okay, thanks.
So I saw a question in the chat from Christine about do you have to do 5 gallons? You mentioned you don't, but I guess I thought I would mention what I do is I do like a half batch, whatever I'm gonna do, like whatever I need to do in a bucket in order so that I can fill the secondary for that into a 3-gallon better bottle. So I mean, you mentioned the same thing, and I thought I'd reinforce about how you size your primary to target what you're going to age your secondary in.
yeah, exactly. You want to go over. You don't want your secondary sitting with, you know, this much headspace. And as you were saying, Eric, even in a bucket, like it doesn't matter the volume you put in that bucket. Know what I mean? You can always target the right volume in a bucket and then transfer it into secondary. So.
Perfect. I'll let you call it here if you want, and we can just chat about, probably keep chatting about Mead since everyone's curious now. but we could call the presentation here if you want.
Yeah, sounds good. I don't actually know how to stop sharing here. Oh, there you go.
Oh, you did. There you go. I thought that was really good. That was a good presentation, Matt. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, Mead's always been one of those things. Like I started homebrewing in 2013, and at that time, a bunch of the guys in the SOBs, which was the club, or I guess it wasn't really, it was an online forum at the time, where all talking about making mead, and I was always skeptical. I'm like, I'm a beer guy. I don't want to make mead. And then I tried meads over the years, tried drinking them, never really got into it. I didn't had a lot of bad ones from various people. And then went to HomebrewCon and tried this bourbon barrel aged braggot from